I want to go ahead and bring in our first guest tonight, founder at Jews for Ron Paul, here to help us discuss the interfaith idea that liberty brings us together. And a prized economist, Glenn, I think you know a little bit about our next guest here as well, Dr. Walter Block. Dr. Walter Block, you are live on the Language of Liberty. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Block, you are on the Language of Liberty.
Great.
It's good to have you with us, sir. We appreciate that you could join us tonight. Why don't you give a little bit, I mean, I could go on all day about your background, and you've been a libertarian thinker, philosopher, economist, written a lot of great books that have influenced many of us within the libertarian movement, the ideology for many years. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your evolution, Dr. Block?
Well, if by evolution you mean how I first came to libertarianism?
Yes, sir.
Well, I was sort of a leftist pinko kid at Brooklyn College in Brooklyn, and Ayn Rand came to lecture, and she came to Brooklyn College to lecture, and I came to boo and hiss her because she was in favor of economic freedom and liberty and stuff like that. There's some sort of echo or something. Do you hear that?
Egoism, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm familiar with Ayn Rand, and objectivism was a big influence on me as well.
Right, and to make a long story short, she and Nathaniel Branden were the ones who converted me to the one true faith of free enterprise. I had several conversations with the two of them, plus Alan Greenspan and Peikoff. And I read two books, Atlas Shrugged and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And after that, I was pretty converted to the limited government libertarian philosophy.
And since then, you've become a senior member at the Mises Institute, also taught school and attained your own PhD, and over the years have spoken out very publicly and written a lot of works defending undefendable positions. That is something that is unique, Doctor, and I wish you would talk a little bit about defending the undefensible positions as a libertarian and as a person who professes a certain faith of sorts.
Well, I wrote that book, Defending the Undefendable, in the early 1970s, and it came out in 1976, and I'm happy to say that it's still selling. What I did there is I took the non-aggression principle, the idea of basic element of libertarianism, that you can do anything you want except you cannot invade or use aggression against other people or their property. And I took a whole host of cases, about 30 different cases, of people who do not violate the non-aggression principle and yet are hated or reviled or despised or prohibited by law, and I defended them. And my idea was that it's all well and good to defend ordinary behavior, but what you really want to defend in order to make libertarianism more understandable is the hard cases. And I defended several, well, about 2.5 dozen, 3 dozen hard cases of libertarianism. For example, let me grab a copy of that book out here. I'll just read the chapters. Each one is somebody that I defend. And the chapters are the prostitute, the pimp, the male chauvinist pig, the drug pusher, the drug addict, the drug dealer, the blackmailer, the slanderer, libeler, denier of academic freedom, advertiser, the person who yells fire in a crowded theater, that's one of my favorites, the gypsy cab driver, the ticket scalper, the dishonest cop, that's not a misprint, or I meant that seriously, the non-government counterfeiter, the miser, inheritor, moneylender, non-contributor to charity, the slumlord, the ghetto merchant, speculator, importer, middleman, profiteer, strip miner, litterer, waste maker, fat capitalist pig employer, scab, rate buster, and employer of child labor. And what all these have in common is that either they're prohibited or by law, or people hate them for doing this, and yet they're not violating the non-aggression axiom of libertarianism. Now, we libertarians, therefore, don't have to defend these activities. For example, I don't really defend prostitution, but we have to defend their legality. We have to say that prostitution, even though some of us might not like that, and I'm not a fan of that, still people who do that, sexual acts between consenting adults for pay, should not go to jail because they do not violate the libertarian non-aggression principle.
There's also another element to this too, Doctor, and as long as we're talking about the, I believe it was 1974, the book Defending the Undefendable, page 156, there is a line that says, it is easy to argue that if you prohibit something that it is bad, that something good will follow. It is simple, but not always true. Can you expound on that line from your book, Doctor?
I'm afraid that different versions have different pages. You say 156. What chapter is that in?
That is, let me go back and look here, The Ghetto Merchant, chapter 21.
Ghetto Merchant. Let me look that up here.
And once again, I did butcher that, so let me read it again for everyone. It is easy to argue that if you prohibit something that is bad, something good will follow. It is simple, but not always true. I found that very interesting.
Oh, yes. Well, the next words are, and it's clearly untrue in the case of the ghetto merchant and his business practices. This facile argument blithely ignores the causes of the problem, why prices are really higher in the ghetto. The point of this chapter is, why is it that prices are very, very high in the inner city, where there's a lot of crime, and where the rich white people live out in the suburbs, grocery prices are much lower? And the obvious answer is, well, there's a lot of crime in the inner cities, and you have to hire extra guards, and you can't be putting food out on the sidewalk because the food will walk away without being paid for, and you're subject to robberies. Whereas in the more affluent neighborhoods with lower crime, you don't have that problem. And another point that I make in this chapter is, where do you think profits will be higher? In the inner city where the black people are, Jesse Jackson and people like that are always saying, well, you know, the Jews or the Orientals or the Koreans are exploiting us black people, and we have to have our own groceries. They're exploiting us because of higher prices. Where do you think profits will be higher in the one or the other? And this is sort of a trick question, because the answer is neither. Profits will tend to equalize in both, because if profits are much higher in the inner city because of the high prices, well then people will tend to leave the suburbs in search of the higher profits, and if profits are higher out there in the suburbs, then people will leave the inner cities and go out there. So profits tend to equalize, and this shows or demonstrates or is one bit of evidence for the claim that the inner city grocer is not exploiting the customers. Rather, he is dealing with the fact that there's so much crime there. So the real problem is not exploitation of merchants, it's rather the crime rate.
Yeah, it's a much different, and we end up, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me like we end up having the wrong debate. At least in the mainstream media, we don't even seem to have the correct debate.
Well, I think you're right.
Symptoms rather than the root problems or first
principles. Yes, and nowhere is that more true than, say, the unemployment rate of young black male teenagers who are unskilled and have a horrendously high unemployment rate. And the usual answer on the part of our glib leftist progressive liberals is, well, it's due to racism. But really it's due to the minimum wage law, which is another chapter in this book where I say if you're going to have a minimum wage law, even though it's beloved of our friends on the left, they think it raises wages. It really doesn't raise wages for people. Rather, what it does is it makes it virtually impossible for them to get jobs in the first place.
Yeah.
You can see this easily if you say, well, why be so niggardly about it? Why just have a minimum wage of $7 or $8 an hour? Why not make it $100 an hour? According to their logic, if you made it $100 an hour, then everyone would make $100 an hour. Wouldn't that be great? That would end poverty. But the obvious common sense notion, and that's all economics is common sense, is that if you had a minimum wage law of $100 an hour, then anyone whose productivity was less than $100 an hour wouldn't have a job at all. For example, suppose my productivity is $70 an hour, which is very high. If you, the employer, had to pay me $100, you'd lose $30 an hour on me, and either you wouldn't hire me in the first place, or if you did, you'd go broke. So the minimum wage law can't help anyone. You got Mitt Romney, a supposed free enterpriser, who is now saying, well, we ought to have a minimum wage. It's only Ron Paul who is sensible and says not only shouldn't we raise it, not only shouldn't we leave it there, but we should get rid of it. Bless that man.
Well, and that would bring me to my next question. This being an interfaith show, and talking about the idea of liberty and how Ron Paul has discussed liberty bringing us together for our individual reasons, whatever they may be. So, could you talk a little bit about, in the framework of that, talk a little bit about your support for Ron Paul's presidential candidacy?
Well, I support Ron Paul on 3 grounds. Really, they're all libertarian grounds, but the 3 grounds are foreign policy, economic policy, and personal liberties. He is magnificent on all 3. He believes in taking foreign policy first. He believes that we shouldn't have a system where we have, 800 military bases in about 130 different countries. And any time any 2 groups get into a fight with each other, we're there. Why are we the world's policemen, especially since we're inept policemen? We kill people with drones and kill innocent people. Why not pull back? It's certainly not defense, it's offense. As every basketball player, now the NBA is having its tournament, everyone knows they yell defense, defense when the other team has the ball. And they know the difference between defense and offense. Unfortunately, the people that don't vote for Ron Paul don't know that difference. So Ron Paul favors a strong defense, maybe a very strong Coast Guard, but not having soldiers all over the place. The second one is economics. He believes in laissez-faire capitalism, economic liberty, personal responsibility, private property. He believes in getting rid of the Fed because the Fed is a central planning bureau for money. The Fed has inflated virtually all the value out of the dollar that they got in 1913 when they started. He favors deregulation, getting rid of regulatory departments. So he's really wonderful on economic liberty, and he's magnificent also on personal liberty. He wants to, say, legalize drugs. A lot of people, especially young black men, are shooting each other and being shot over drugs. We have this Trayvon Martin situation now, and people are upset that a young black man was shot. Well, if he were shot by another young black man, nobody would even take a notice of it because there's just so much of that going around. So Ron Paul wants to legalize drugs, which would save young black male lives and would pretty much empty our prisons. Not totally, but I think something like 2/3 or 60% of all the prisoners in U.S. jails are there because of drug violations, and they're non-aggressive. They were non-violent. So on all three of these grounds, Ron Paul is just utterly magnificent. And I think I really should talk about Jews for Ron Paul, since I'm one of the founders of that group.
Yes, sir.
Would that be okay?
Yes, sir. Please do.
Okay, the reason I was instrumental in setting up or helping set up Jews for Ron Paul was that Ron Paul was accused of being an anti-Semite. And this is preposterous, because you ask him who are his two favorite guides, who are his two mentors, who are his two gurus, and the obvious answer, he mentions them all the time, are Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. And there's one thing you have to say about Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, and that they were Jewish. So it's a very strange anti-Semite who picks his two leading guides who were Jews. Another reason that Ron Paul was accused of being anti-Semitic is he wanted to stop all foreign aid to Israel. Well, that's true, he did, and that sounds horrible. But he also wanted to stop all foreign aid to everyone, not just to Israel. And as it happens, the United States presently gives, 6 or 8 or 10 times as much to all the Arab countries put together as it gives Israel. So it's giving Israel's enemies more money than it's giving to Israel. And if you stop both, then absolutely Israel loses because they have less money. But relatively they gain because their enemies now have less money than before, and the amount of money that was given to Egypt and these other countries was way more than was given to Israel. So these are some of the reasons. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg of the case that Ron Paul is not anti-Semitic because of his Israeli policy. And there's lots more. What Ron Paul realizes... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and it's my understanding that that when Israel had taken care of herself in the past, that Ron Paul has actually stood up and said Israel's a sovereign nation, and she has the right to make her own decisions, as every sovereign nation should.
Yes, I think that's a very, very good point. You put your finger right on a crucially important point. Ron Paul is known as Dr. No because a lot of votes, won against 536 or something. Well, when Israel bombed the Iraqi nuclear facility in Oturik, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, every other Congress criticized them except Ron Paul. And Ron said, look, Israel has a right to sovereign country and none of our business. Whereas everyone else was saying, oh, no, you can't do that. Obama's recent message to the Israeli-Palestinian Arab situation was that they should have negotiations, and the negotiations should start with the 1967 Green Line borders. Well, who the hell is Obama to mix his mitts in where they don't belong? Why should he get involved in that? What business is it of his, and why should he be involved in that? And there was another case, the Suez in 1956, where Israel pretty much took over the entire Suez Peninsula in one of the wars. And Eisenhower forced Israel to give it back. So when Ron Paul says that he wants to have an arm's length relation, a friendly relation, not only with Israel, but with every nation, to construe this as anti-Semitism is just plain wrong.
Well, I have to ask you, Dr. Block, if I have this assessment that, Dr. Ron Paul is, he's accused of being an isolationist, calls himself a non-interventionist, and my understanding, the people that usually want to criticize him and label him as an isolationist, I actually would see them more as isolationists because of the economic sanctions that they would perpetuate on other nations, and which, can you talk about that, the potential of trade wars to lead to real wars?
Yes, well, there's this Cato Institute, which some people think is libertarian, and on some issues they undoubtedly are, but on this issue they're horrible. What they did is they criticized Ron Paul because he was against NAFTA. North American Free Trade Association. He's against NAFTA and CAFTA and all these contracts and other agreements for trade. Ron Paul is much more radical than that. He doesn't want to have NAFTA. He wants to have a unilateral declaration of free trade with every nation on earth, whether or not they have tariffs against us. Ron Paul correctly sees this as two men in a rowboat, and one idiot shoots a hole in the rowboat. That's the tariff, or the quota. Should the other guy shoot another hole in the rowboat? Of course not. So Ron Paul would say that if China or any other country wants to have tariff barriers, and they don't, that's their foolishness. We shouldn't emulate them and also have tariff barriers. And therefore, there's no need to negotiate with the Chinese or anyone. I picked China because Mitt Romney is frothing at the mouth at China. He thinks that they're undervaluing their currency. We're the ones that are really doing that, and therefore selling their goods cheaper to us and exporting more and importing less. And Obama is crazy on this issue as well. The two of them are not so different, Obama and Romney. Obama's bragging about insourcing, that he wants to create manufacturing jobs in the United States, and hates with a purple passion this outsourcing, like when you call your credit card company or your bank, you get some guy in India, probably has better command of English than we do. He speaks a beautiful British accent. And Obama is frothing at the mouth at that. How dare any company outsource to a third country? Well, these guys are sort of like Smoot-Hawley tariff advocates. That's the tariff that exacerbated the Great Depression in 1933, or in the 1930s. So I think Ron Paul stands head and shoulders above his two competitors, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, in terms of free trade. And the Cato Institute, to their shame, doesn't realize that Ron Paul really favors free trade and economic freedom internationally. So in terms of isolationism, Ron Paul is not at all an isolationist. He wants to have free trade with everyone. He wants to have our orchestras go there and their orchestras come to us. He wants to have good relationships with everyone. He doesn't want to have tariffs and quotas, whereas the other two, Obama and Romney, they're the isolationists. Now, Ron Paul is a non-interventionist, namely he doesn't want to have imperialism. He doesn't want to take over other countries for their own good or for oil or for our oil, whatever. It doesn't matter what you're doing the imperialism for. Ron Paul is an anti-imperialist, and the other two, Romney and Obama, are both imperialists.
Well, you mentioned you first came around to, and I'm kind of switching back on subjects here on you, but you mentioned founding the organization Jews for Ron Paul, and actually kind of reminds me of the reason that Nick Allison founded Combat Veterans for Ron Paul, and that I came on board with him, and others have as well, and there's been a groundswell in answer to the only little small blurb of media coverage that tried to explain why Ron Paul would have so much support from veterans, which he does, which even if they make that fact known, that's rare, but when they do, they've never really tried to give an explanation in the mainstream media. The only thing that I had ever heard was to write us off as the guys that they're too young, naive, they don't know anything, they haven't been over there in a combat zone yet, they're the newbies, they don't understand, and that's why they're supporting Ron Paul. They're just young and naive and have no combat experience. Well, now there's a lot of us and a growing number of us that are saying we are combat veterans, and we have served in a combat zone, and we still say we support Ron Paul, and we'll be willing to serve our country in self-defense any day. The non-aggression principle, my understanding of that is that that self-defense is desirable, but for us to be continually occupying in perpetuity overseas nations in a militaristic style, basically being a paramilitary police force for years on end in any area, I don't see the disconnect there, why people can't see why Americans can't see why people in foreign nations are going to get upset, and they're going to want us to leave, even if they initially welcomed us. The longer we stay, the larger those movements are going to become that want us to leave.
No, I think you're right. There's a very strong parallel between the two groups, Jews for Ron Paul and combat veterans for Ron Paul. Jews for Ron Paul was started to combat, if I can use that word, the notion that Ron Paul is an anti-Semite. And combat veterans for Ron Paul was started, I understand, to combat the idea that Ron Paul is a pacifist, or Ron Paul doesn't believe in a strong defense. He certainly believes in a strong defense. He just doesn't believe in a strong offense, or any offense at all. And one of the very important points that the media forget about entirely is that of all the active military people that have given money to any of the candidates for president, Ron Paul's got more, not only than any one of them, like Mitt Romney or Santorum or Gingrich, but all of them combined, all of them put together, including Obama. So the military speaks, I won't say with one voice, but with a very powerful voice. Unfortunately, you guys are doing better than us because Jews don't give more money to Ron Paul than anyone else, I'm unhappy to say. So you guys are doing a better job, but we're trying our best. But I think that both of these groups are very important because these are two very unfair criticisms made of Ron Paul, one that he's an anti-Semite, two that he doesn't care about defending the country. And also you have to realize that of all the 12, no, I think there was one, that guy from Utah, with the exception of him, and maybe the exception of, no, the guy from Texas, Rick Perry, Ron Paul is the only guy who served in the military.
Exactly.
The rest of these folk are chicken hawk generals, you know, like Obama never served in the military. Mitt Romney was busy in France during the Vietnam War. None of these guys, Gingrich, Santorum, none of these chicken hawk soldiers served in the military, and Ron Paul was a captain in the Air Force, I think it was. He's the only one with military experience, and these guys have the audacity and the nerve to say that Ron Paul won't defend the country and Ron Paul is a coward and an anti-Semite and this and that and the other. And God bless the two groups, Jews for Ron Paul and combat veterans for Ron Paul. And there are other groups, Catholics for Ron Paul and other groups like that, that have each one been set up in order to combat one particular slur against our man Ron.
Well, and isn't it really a fight, a combat in the world of ideas? Isn't that really what it boils down to? My understanding of the Ayn Rand approach, and actually when it comes to objectivism, if I understood objectivism accurately, it was not so much that we were to be followers of Ayn Rand's philosophy, but more that she wanted each individual to develop their own philosophy.
Well, I wish I could agree with you. I wish that were true, but I had bad experiences with him. Even though she converted me from my leftist ways into libertarianism, she was not a libertarian, and she rejected libertarianism. She called us hippies of the right. She was an objectivist. And she was sort of a cultist. I mean, when I went to her meetings at the Nathaniel Branden Institute, you could ask a question like, oh, well, on page 565 of your book, you said this. Could you elaborate on that, please? And she would welcome questions like that, softball questions. Whereas if you said, well, on page 563 you say X, and on page 205 you say Y, and X and Y contradict each other, she would say, get out. She would kick you out for disagreeing with her. So this is hardly open-minded, you know, encouraging people to think for themselves. And also, she had all sorts of views on metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and aesthetics. And if you didn't buy the whole thing, you were kicked out again. For example, I like Mozart, not Rachmaninoff, and for her, Rachmaninoff was particularly rational and Mozart wasn't, and, you know, I thought, wow, that's a little weird. You know, so I just stick to the non-aggression axiom of non-aggression principle of libertarianism, and, you know, you can have any views you want on, oh, and she was viciously anti-religious. I happen to be an atheist too, but I'm pro-religious. I support religion because it's an alternative option to the government, which I see as a much worse kind of a thing. So she was a militant atheist, and Murray Rothbard, who is my mentor, she told him, Murray's wife was, Joey, was a Christian. She believed in God. And Ayn Rand told Murray, well, you know, you don't have to divorce her right now. You can give her 6 months. But if she doesn't convert to atheism in 6 months, either you divorce her or I'm kicking you out of the movement. Now, that's a little weird. No, it's not a little weird. It's a lot weird.
Kicking you out of the movement. That's great.
Yes, it's very, very weird.
Well, okay, so we come back around to the interfaith idea then, or for the show anyway, but the idea that we all have the freedom of conscience. So tell me in your own words, Dr. Block, in what way do we view God and government? In what ways do they go together or not go together? Break it down for an infantry soldier.
Well, you know, the two are very different. Look, there have been religious people in the past that have violated the non-aggression principle. The Inquisition and religious wars come to mind. But do you know how many people died in the Inquisition, which took maybe 3 or 4 centuries? Most people don't realize this. I'm sorry?
So many thousands.
Only a few thousand. The best estimates are between 3 and 10,000. Now, look, the unjustified killing of any person is a horror. But when you compare the number of people that were killed in the Inquisition with the number of people killed by governments, whether in wars or killing their own people, there you're not in the thousands, you're in the tens of millions. So you have to have a little proportion here. Yes, religion has done bad things. We all do bad things. We're all imperfect creatures. But when you compare religion with government, I think that government comes out very badly. Nowadays, religion, okay, they're having some problems with the Catholics who've been abusing small boys, but that's a very small minority of Catholic priests, and hopefully that problem will go away. I work at a Jesuit institution, by the way, Loyola University, and I can say that this is a very, very minority kind of a problem. Just a small percentage of priests did that horrible thing. But when you compare what government does, I mean, Obama's now killing citizens without a free trial, without a fair trial. He's droning people in Afghanistan and previously in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's killing many, many more people. So the question is, does religion per se violate the non-aggression axiom? And the answer is, of course not. Therefore, religion is compatible with liberty. And then the question is, well, does government per se necessarily violate the non-aggression principle? And the answer is not so clear. Maybe yes. Maybe taxes are a necessary violation of rights. So if it comes to a choice for libertarians between government and religion, I think religion is compatible with libertarianism, whereas government, the radical libertarian view would be it's not, and the more moderate libertarian view, the minimal government libertarian view would say that when government exceeds its proper function, then it is incompatible with libertarianism. George Washington, I think, phrased it very well. This moderate libertarian view, he said that government is like a fire. When it's limited to the fireplace, it's very beneficial. But when it gets out into the kitchen, living room, and the bathroom, and the rest of the house, then it's very, very bad. And we now have out-of-control government, and who is trying to control government? I'll give you one guess. The right answer, of course, is Ron Paul. He believes in really limited government, whereas these other two, Romney and Obama, they're really twins. They're both almost indistinguishable, and it's not just the Obamacare and the Romney care for medical socialism or socialized medicine, but in many, many other ways. In foreign policy, they both want to prohibit drugs. Neither of them favors economic freedom. they're like peas in a pod, whereas Ron Paul is very different and vastly superior to either of them.
Excellent. Dr. Block, we don't want to wear you out too much tonight, but I have one more question. I have to satisfy my own curiosity here a little bit. When I was in the military, someone found out that I was libertarian and asked me how a libertarian could join the military. And you know, coming from the ideology, how could a libertarian be in the military and undergo the kind of day-to-day disciplinary procedures and basically the hands-on from your superiors, having the ability to come in and review your personal items at any time, day or night. You know, all these things that basically there are no civil liberties in the Army. You know, and they wanted me to speak as to how I could be in the military and put up with that as a libertarian. And my answer for that is basically that it's because it's a voluntary Army, and I was able to volunteer myself into service where I knew I was giving up certain rights in order to perform that service for a prescribed amount of time, at which time when I would be discharged, I would be restored, you know, my rights would be restored to me. And that's a very simplistic way of putting it, I'm sure, in layman's terms. But I wonder, in any way, does this relate to your theory of involuntary slave contracts? And if so, can you tell me how? If not, would you still talk a little bit about your theory of involuntary slave contracts?
Well, you're asking 2 or 3 questions there, but I'm delighted and happy to try to wrestle with all of them.
It's an honor for me to speak to you, Dr. Block. I appreciate your answer, sir.
Well, I discern about 3 questions in there. First of all, let me talk about voluntary slave contracts. I believe in voluntary slave contracts, and this sounds horrible. It sounds like I favor slavery. I don't favor involuntary slavery, but I favor voluntary slavery. For example, my son has this horrible illness, and we don't have socialized medicine. The government won't help him, and it'll cost $5 million to save his life. You have long wanted me to be your slave, and you're a very rich man. And I make the following deal with you. I say, look, Adam, give me $5 million. In response, I will become your slave, and I'll give the $5 million to my son's doctors, and I'll save his life. And we both gain. You value my servitude to you more than the $5 million you have to pay for it, and I value my son's life more than my own liberty. So we both gain in an economic sense, and it's justified because it's voluntary. So that's how I would defend voluntary slavery. Now, with regard to the volunteer military, this is something that Milton Friedman favored very much during the Vietnam War, during the time of the Vietnam War when we had the draft. And he got a lot of credit in the libertarian community for favoring the volunteer military. I disagreed with Milton Friedman on this because, to me, the question, an even more important question than how do you raise the Army voluntarily or through the draft is the fight justified in the first place? And as far as I can see, we had no business being in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali, I think, said no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word. No Vietnamese ever attacked us. What in bloody blue blazes were we doing there? Now, why was Milton Friedman so adamant that we should have a volunteer military? Well, there were 2 reasons, one of which I agree with and one of which I detest. One I agree with is that the draft is involuntary servitude or slavery. I agree with him there. But the other reason was, if we had a volunteer military, Milton Friedman said quite correctly, it would be more efficient. We would better be able to beat the Vietnamese. Well, I didn't want to beat the Vietnamese. if there was any justice, they would have beaten us because we were attacking them. They never attacked us. So I diverge very sharply from Milton Friedman's view that the volunteer military is justified. Yes, other things equal it's justified, but if it's purposefully to campaign an unjust war, then it's not just. Look, let's take the Nazi concentration camps. Nazi concentration camps were killing Jews and blacks and gays and Romani and other non-Aryans. And let's suppose that the guards there, the torturer guards, were drafted. And a German Milton Friedman came along and said, well, you know, we shouldn't really draft these guards because they don't have their heart in it. They're not really as vicious as they could be. Let's have a volunteer hiring of concentration camp guards. Would we regard this as pro-freedom? No. We would say the question of how you hire the guards is very secondary to the issue that you shouldn't be killing innocent people in the first place. So I don't go along with the volunteer military if the purpose of it is to better enable us to more efficiently fight unjust wars. If we have an unjust war, we should fight it inefficiently. We shouldn't do injustice efficiently. If we have to do injustice, we should do it inefficiently. Now, the third question that I think you're asking is, well, what about the violation of your personal privacy? You know, they go into your underwear, God knows what they do. And here I agree with what you said. If we're having a just war, and in Murray Rothbard's view, and I agree with him on this, the only two just wars that the U.S. has ever fought was the Revolutionary War, the War of Secession from Great Britain, 1776, and the War of Southern Secession in 1861, the Southern side. Now, suppose you, Adam, were a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and it was a just war, and George Washington and his colonel or captain got into your belongings. Well, then what you said I think is absolutely true. It was a volunteer action on your part. You were fighting a just battle, and in the view of your commanding officer, they have to violate your privacy and do a lot worse to you than that. Well, you agreed to it, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to do that. So I hope I've answered the three parts of your question.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Glenn, you want to get in on this before we take a break?
Sure thing. I've been listening with great interest to this. Pleasure to meet you, Dr. Block. I've enjoyed your work for years. I want to expand a bit when you talk about unjust wars and versus voluntary military. A lot of these people, especially the younger ones that get in, are very well motivated. They want to do the right thing. They want to protect freedom. But the government is engaging in one of the major deadly sins in libertarianism, and that is fraud. They are defrauded into becoming the agent of the government in this case. So that fact, I think if it was more clearly understood, would clarify a lot of people's outlook on the voluntary versus involuntary military. And of course, an involuntary military, as you say, that's involuntary servitude, and that's a bad thing. But I think it's an equally bad thing to take well-meaning, well-motivated people and defraud them into acting as the gun, as it were, with politicians as the hand holding the gun.
Well, let me respond by analogy. I'm a professor. I'm never supposed to answer direct questions. Otherwise, they'll kick me out of the professoriate. Let's take policemen as an analogy to soldiers. The two are not too different. Suppose I become a policeman. Now, there are two kinds of things that I can do, one of them which is entirely just, and the other is very unjust. One thing I can do is stop murderers and rapists and muggers and thieves and people who engage in fraud. If that's all I did, then I'd be a clear good guy. But on the other hand, I'm expected to arrest prostitutes and drug people using drugs. And as far as I can see, prostitution and drug selling between consenting adults are legitimate things. And if I do that, I'm a bad guy. I'm acting incompatibly with libertarianism. Now, I don't want to criticize people who become policemen, but the point is that if they arrest victimless criminals, namely people engaged in drugs or prostitution or pornography or gambling or whatever it is, they're acting incompatibly with libertarianism. Are we perpetrating fraud on a young police recruit? I don't think so, because they know what the job concerns. What the job concerns is upholding the law, and some of the laws are just, and others of the law are unjust. And if you uphold an unjust law, then you're acting incompatibly with libertarianism. Now let's take soldiers. Are they really engaging in fraud? I don't think so. I think nowadays, when a young person enters into the military, whichever the branch, they know darn well that they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to Afghanistan, or they're going to go to South Korea, or to Japan, or Germany, or God knows where. They know that, or they should know, that they are not defending the country, that they're engaging in offense. So I really can't see my way clear to saying that these soldiers are victimized by fraud and are therefore innocent. I think any person who isn't mentally deficient and joins the Army, given that the Army is involved mainly in unjustified actions, well, I think we libertarians should have a problem with it. Now, I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party, and I don't want to get you guys angry at me because I regard us on the same side. But still, I have to, tell the truth as I see it. Let me complicate this a little bit, if I can get into my radical shoes. Would it be justified for me to become a Nazi concentration camp guard?
Well, I wouldn't.
Consider the following scenario. Let's suppose that the Nazi concentration camp guards have to kill 100 people a day. And I, a good guy, a libertarian, want to become a Nazi concentration camp guard. And what I'm going to do is I'll only kill 90 people a day, and I'll save 10. I have to kill 90 because if I don't kill 90, they'll see that I'm not really on their side, and they'll kill me, and that'll be the end of it. But what I can do is every day save 10 people. Well, according to libertarian punishment theory, we now have the libertarian Nuremberg trial for me, and I think that the proper libertarian analysis of me is that if any of the heirs of any of the people that I've killed, and I've killed 90 a day, still don't forgive me, well, then I have to be executed because I'm a murderer. But before you execute me, what you have to do is you have to give me a medal and hold a parade in my honor, because I saved 10 people a day, say for a month. I saved 300 people, innocent people, who, but for my actions, would have died. But still, so it's a very complicated question. Am I justified in doing this? Well, let's take an unjustified war. Let's take the Vietnam War, where the soldiers were fragging their officers. Well, if they did that, then God help me, maybe I shouldn't say it, probably illegal. Let's take the Nazi soldiers who were fighting the Russians, or maybe fighting the Americans, and suppose the guy joined the Nazi army and started shooting his fellow Nazi soldiers who were in the wrong. We were in the right there. Well, I think he'd be justified in doing that. So I hate to pull this very, very radical thing on you, but I think the only way to do justice to the questions you're asking is to get to the roots, to get to the very basics of libertarian theory, and sometimes libertarian theory is very radical.
Sometimes it is. Dr. Walter Block, there are about 1 million questions that I could ask you. I could wear you out all night asking you questions and picking your brain, sir, but we are up on a hard break, and appreciate you joining us tonight and want to give you a chance to say goodbye.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. I think you're doing the Lord's work, and I'm very much in debt to you and your efforts.
Thank you, sir. You have a great evening.
Take care. Bye.
All right, Glenn, we're going to go to a break, and